Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Deep Dive podcast in the McDougal Sports Channel. This episode, we're going to go over the NFC East and look at their drafts, sort of where they filled needs, where they still have needs, and then kind of think about where we think they might fit, in the division this year. So first off, we're going to talk about the Eagles. So the Eagles, they have a pretty strong roster, obviously, perennial playoff team. So really, some of the needs that I identified is that they need the interior offensive line needs some bolstering. Their defensive ends, they have solid starters, but no really difference makers. And then they have a good secondary, but they're aging and that they need additional talent. So if we look at their draft class, first we have the first round with Quinyon Mitchell out of Toledo, cornerback. And then we have our second round is Cooper DeJean, also a defensive back from Iowa, more than likely a safety, but I think there's a lot of versatility there. In the third round, we have Hunt, who's a outside linebacker. Fourth round, Will Shipley, a running back. Fifth round, Aeneas Smith, wide receiver. Fifth round, again, Jeremiah Trotter, another linebacker. They use a comp pick in the fifth round on a guard, Trevor Keegan. And then the sixth round, Johnny Wilson, definitely a pretty traitsy wide receiver that needs to develop a lot. And then then their last pick, also in the sixth round, is another guard. So they did address their interior offensive line, but it really wasn't until much later. They didn't really address defensive end at all, unless if some of these players might be able to have some flexibility or a transition. But they did get two either current or future starters in Mitchell and DeJean. So I do see them playing a lot. I think, though, outside linebackers and will probably, and even maybe Shipley might contribute in special teams. But with the guards and Johnny Wilson, I think it's going to be a lot of more of a developmental piece. They're going to sort of see what they got, see what they have, and then kind of keep on building out. So I don't necessarily see a ton of impact from this draft class in terms of this year, but definitely a lot of it will depend on training camp battles, right? So, Mitchell might be a starter day one. He might sort of need to sort of sit back a little bit, sort of play in certain situations, more of a situational backup type role, but then transition in, maybe even become a starter over the year. I think a lot of it will just depend on how pro ready he is in terms of learning the defense. I'm not super familiar with the Eagles' defense, but I'm guessing that their scheme is going to be more complex than what he used in Toledo. I think DeJean will probably get more time on the field just because he has such a versatile skill set where you kind of just find ways to get him on the field as opposed to, kind of like allowing him to sort of, sort of work on it. And you really want to utilize, when you draft a player like that, you really want to utilize his skill set as quickly as possible. And I do see maybe more Johnny Wilson than Aeneas Smith. I do think that they may find ways to get him on the field, especially in red zone. He's such a big target. It's sort of hard to not have him in there. I think because of the change with the kickoff rule, you're having less opportunities for some of the more lanky, athletes sort of running downfield. But you do have, punts and stuff like that too. So I don't know if he will sort of be good enough to be able to play special teams at the next level, but definitely some possibilities there. So a decent draft. I would say they definitely took best player available. I don't know if taking two corners back to back or two defensive backs at least back to back, was addressing their needs sort of this year. But I definitely think that it's going to make a huge difference moving forward. So going next to the Giants. So the Giants have a lot of needs. So obviously they're sort of lower end sort of team. So they have a wide receiver, tight end, running back, defensive tackle, corner, and safety. Those are sort of the needs that I identified looking at their roster. So first round they drafted Malik Neighbors, and then the second round they got Tyler Nubin, safety out of Minnesota. Third round is Phillips, his corner, and then Theo Johnson, a tight end, and then Tyron Tracy Jr. is a running back, and then in the sixth round we have Darius. I think it's Wasow as a linebacker. So he did this draft. I think addressed multiple needs. I think a lot of stuff sort of fell to them. They didn't necessarily have to reach a lot. I mean, obviously you can't draft everything in one year, but it gives an immediate need, provides depth in positions, and possible either one day or some at some point during the season starters. So I doubt obviously Neighbors is going to be a day one starter, not exactly a tough wide receiver room. And then Nubin, I also peg him in as a day one starter. I think when you draft a safety like Nubin, you're drafting someone whose game is going to translate really well into the NFL. Maybe not the high end sort of talent that you might get with maybe some of the more tradesy sort of safeties or defensive backs that came out this year, but definitely going to make a difference. And then I actually think Theo Johnson has a really good potential to to maybe not necessarily start, but be like a pretty big contributor. I think he's going to sort of give them something that they don't necessarily have on the roster, and it's going to make I think it's going to make a difference. I mean, is it going to win games? I mean, but maybe not. Sort of depends on what happens, but there's definitely some potential there. And a lot of their other picks, like Tracy Jr., the running back out of Purdue, and Wasow, linebacker. I think that's more of a maybe pass rushing situations, and then special teams. Um, so I think they did really well here. If I were to give it a grade, I would probably give it like an A minus because I do think that it's a lot easier to draft and best player available and fit needs when you have a lot of needs. So it does make things a little easier from a drafting perspective. But I think they did a really good job. I honestly don't have any issues with any of the drafts that they did. I think that getting Neighbors with the number one pick, I think that was like, um, I don't know necessarily an ideal circumstance because I think that they do have, some other areas that they could have gone with that pick if things had just fallen a little different. But if you asked um, Giants fans going into the draft, how do you feel about Neighbors? With your I think it was sixth pick if I remember right. I think that people would be super super stoked about that. So I do think that their draft lined up well, not just with Neighbors, but also a lot of the other picks too. And we'll just sort of see how people pan out because that's sort of it's always the thing, right? So next one to talk about the Commanders. So the Commanders also another team, obviously, that have a lot of needs. So tight end, quarterback, defensive end, corner, free safety, nickel corner, and the slot wide receiver. Those were the ones when I looked at their draft. Those were the positions that I really saw that were kind of kind of the need positions going into the draft. So obviously, with the number 2 overall pick, we had Jaden Daniels, quarterback. Then we had Newton, the defensive tackle out of Illinois, and then Sainstrill, the defensive back from Michigan, and another second round pick. They actually had 3 second round picks this year, and then Sinna is a tight end. And then they got a tackle slash guard in Coleman in the third round. They got Luke McCaffrey, so it's a very interesting pick for them. And then McGee, a linebacker, in the fifth round. Their second fifth round pick was Hampton, a safety, and then the seventh round was Jean Baptiste, defensive end from Notre Dame. So I give this one, I would probably give it like a B. They addressed a lot of needs, obviously. Defensive tackle is not a need, but there is a need for like a succession plan for Allen, who's currently 29, who's probably I would say their best defensive tackle. They filled a lot of needs on paper. Luke McCaffrey was kind of a luxury pick. May not have a ton of usage unless if they run him out of the slot a lot, which they probably will. Um, And so they had a lot of sort of third round picks, and they may just have had the highest grade on him. Obviously, the name recognition goes a long way, but I do think that the player will fit well in that like in the overall offense. I do have a little concern where I think McCaffrey might be a little redundant with some of the other speedy receivers that they have, but I think there's nothing wrong with adding to that room. So they didn't address a defensive end until their last pick. They might be hoping that Mosau could like help on passing downs. I think he has some pass rush pop if I remember right, and they're kind of going to be relying on some of the late round picks from last year to develop. It's definitely their most important or their weakest positions on defense. It was like the most important to sort of develop. Obviously, with the Commanders, you can't address every position in one draft. But if they hit on some of their top picks, it's going to help them improve a ton. So, like with, if Jaden Daniels turns out to be a sort of the next sort of maybe not like top five quarterback in a few years, but even like a, top 10 type quarterback, as he develops, obviously it's a good pick, but obviously if he flops out and it doesn't really work out, obviously they could have had Marvin Harrison Jr. or there's always it's hindsight's 2020 with a lot of this stuff, so we'll just see how everyone pans out. But on paper, in terms of trying to draft players who sort of fit needs, draft players who they like had high grades on. I don't really see any major reaches in the draft. So I may have gone for more of a nickel corner as opposed to a safety in the fifth round personally, because I think there are some players that were there that I may have rated more highly, but again, a lot of it's scheme based and what they want these players to do and a lot of that sort of stuff. So I don't see anything that jumps off the page here that makes me think that it's not going to work out. The only things that I do have a little concerns with is that they don't really have a second outside receiver. So that's gonna be interesting to see how they see who kind of shows out there. They might be looking at running a different type of scheme that maybe doesn't necessarily need a ton of like sort of big wide receivers on the outside. But I do see a bunch of starters here. So I see, obviously Daniels, Saintsdrill, Sinnott, Coleman, might like in certain packages, and then Mosau, I think situational pass rusher. So definitely an interesting draft, and I think of all of the drafts, I actually probably like um, I probably like the Commanders the most, but I think you're going to get more impact from the Giants. So definitely, it'll be fun to see sort of how a lot of this stuff pans out. So lastly in the division, we have the Cowboys. So the Cowboys do have actually a lot of needs for being a playoff team. Obviously, we saw what happened against the Packers, so that might have something to do with it. But what I see is I see wide receiver, tackle, center, running back, linebacker, and then slot corner as sort of their needs. So with their first pick, they got Tyler Guyton as a tackle from Oklahoma. They got Nealon, who's an edge in the second round. Third round, their first third rounder, they got Cooper Beebe, a guard. Third rounder, they got Liafu, a linebacker. And then fifth round was Carson, just a corner. Sixth round, Flournoy, a wide receiver. Seventh, they got another tackle, and then in their second seventh, they got a defensive tackle. So they filled a lot of holes, but the second round edge was sort of a luxury pick. So I'm not sure if that's like a major need, but I do think that is if he becomes a good player, it's a great pick. It doesn't really matter. You want good players no matter what. But if it's sort of not doesn't turn out to be a great pick, obviously I think there are probably were other players that were just as good in other positions that might be more of need, and even if they hadn't panned out as well as you'd hope, obviously it would still be an upgrade in terms of performance and talent and all that sort of stuff. Um, so there's a major hole at outside wide receiver. They're relying a lot on the late round rookie or Jalen Tolbert in developing a lot. He hasn't so far. He hasn't really had a lot of production. I think he had just like 300 yards or something like that last year. So got some guard depth and future starter when Martin decides to retire. Overshown has shown that he needs more time to develop to reach his potential, but Liafu might be a similar player, but maybe more of a natural linebacker since he's not converting to safety like Overshown did. So there is the potential that if Overshown doesn't make that leap, maybe Liafu gets some opportunities there. I don't know if Overshown would consider a move back to safety if it didn't work at linebacker. I think at this point you kind of tried to change a lot, develop a lot, and I think you want to sort of stick with what you got to do. But hopefully it works out, and then you have Liafu as sort of like a backup and then special teamer. But I think you do have a succession plan there if the play doesn't necessarily go up as much as you'd like. So the wide receiver that they took late in Flournoy definitely fits a need of what they need, but just in terms of obviously not someone who's going to contribute a ton day one. But I do see a lot of potential in that pick, so I think there is good. BB does have flexibility to play guard and center. But if he does play center, then they're still going to need to a guard to replace Zach Martin when he either his play drops off or he decides to retire. But so definitely a lot of interesting picks here. I would probably give it like a B minus if I were to put a grade on it. There's a lot of holes to fill for a playoff team, so in a way it kind of makes drafting a little easier because you're not quite having to pick for need as much as maybe with some other teams where you only have maybe 3 or 4 areas where people could realistically step in and have some playing time. So I think overall in this division, I definitely see it being a lot more competitive. It's kind of been Philly and Cowboys, and that's kind of been it. I think a lot of it depends on what happens with Janie Daniels. Like, does he take off? Because if he takes off as a rookie, even if it takes him like maybe week 5, week 6 to get in, I do see some chances for some turnarounds there, and I'm really interested to see what happens with the Giants. I think they're in this like weird situation where they haven't really been playing bad enough to be able to get like a top end quarterback. Um, so like having Neighbors on there, giving Theo Johnson another nice target for Daniel Jones. I think it is. I know this has been something that's been said like over and over again that it's like this is the make or break year for Daniel Jones, and he still kind of just sticks in there and doesn't really have like realistic competition to go against him. But take it with a grain of salt. But I do think this is a make or break year for Daniel Jones once again. And then with the Eagles, it's so interesting because I think with Jalen Hurts and the whole kind of like quarterback sneak controversy and all that sort of stuff, um, getting more possessions for the offense is so important, right? So I do think that like while on paper maybe like going back to back defensive back may not have addressed some of their other needs that they may have. Obviously, replacing Kelsey at center is going to be could kind of be a huge thing, but I do think that they have someone in there that can at least be serviceable. But I think with getting those corners, um, I think they'll be able to maybe get some interceptions, maybe get some tip balls, maybe cause some fumbles, whatever it is that they might be able to do. I think there's going to be some like really good effects from that because because of Jalen Hurts with the way he plays and the way he can do those sneaks, it really makes like possessions where they're not getting anything a lot less likely than other teams that are relying on like a more standard sort of kind of way. They're not going to go for it on fourth down as much. So I'm really interested to see what happens with the Eagles defense. I think the last couple of years their defense has kind of slid a little bit. So I'm going to be interested to see if Mitchell and Dejon start because I think that will obviously be a big part of it. But I'm also interested to see about what kind of like turnovers and all that sort of stuff that they might be able to force because I think if they can, it's going to go a long way in in maybe turning things around a little bit because I know their kind of quick out with the playoffs was obviously disappointing. for Eagles fans and the team. So so that's pretty much it. I appreciate you guys sticking around, watching this. What I'm going to be doing is doing similar videos for other divisions around the league, kind of circling back, kind of closing up the draft and kind of where I see the team sort of going in, and then we're gonna dive a little more into some of the other into training camp battles and some other kinds of looking ahead to the season and looking at schedules and kind of maybe doing some of that sort of stuff. So I appreciate you guys for checking it in, and I will see you soon.